we'll see what God is going to do here. But I want to double back now. That closes the Bible study of chapter 16. Fortunately, it's a short one. It gives me a chance to show you something that we normally don't have the time to get into. But I want to talk about the last 12 verses of Mark. And so there are some scholars who believe the last 12 verses were not in the original and were, quote, added later. And this has become a dispute among many scholars. Many Bibles have a footnote to that effect, excessively relying on the Alexandrian codices of the 4th century and the writings of Westcott and Hort. Now, I won't get into Westcott and Hort. They were Greek experts, but you wouldn't trust them to teach your Sunday school class. They were not believers, and that's another whole story. But anyway, but it's now becoming increasingly understood that these 12 verses were expurgated from the Alexandrian codices, and they were in the original. That may shock many people. Why do I say that? Well, Irenæus, writing in 150 A.D., quotes them in his commentary, as does Hippolytus, who wrote in the 2nd century. In the Syriac Peshitta, 2nd century, and in the Curetonian Syriac, that's 3rd century, older than any of the Greek manuscripts, both of these contain these 12 verses. The Latin verses, typically by Jerome, had access to Greek versions no longer available that included the 12 verses. The Vulgate was only a revision of the Vetus Italia of the 2nd century, which does contain these 12 verses. The Gothic version of 350 AD contains them. The Egyptian versions of the Mephitic, the Coptic, Thebic, and the Sahidic. There's 4 different Egyptian versions that have them. The Armenian, 5th century, Ethiopic, 4th through the 7th century, and the Georgian, 6th century contains these. Now, what about the church fathers? Well, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenæus, I mentioned, Hippolytus, I mentioned, Vicentius, and oodles of others you've probably never heard of, all make reference to the various verses at various times in their writings. And I'm indebted to serious scholarship that has dug all this out, which certainly indicates the 12 verses were in the originals. And we could go on with Augustine and Nestorius, and on they go. So much for that. But I don't want to rest on that. I want to acquaint you with a security system that never rusts or wears out, that continually guards over your text for you. Did you know there was such a thing? Sevens. How many of you have seen sevens in the Bible? That's your hands? Anybody without their hand up hasn't been reading their Bible, right? You all know about the sevens. Okay, they're everywhere. They're in at least 600 passages. Some of them are very overt. They're very visible. Some are structural. You only see it if you start diagramming the thing. Some are actually hidden. You have to really hunt for them. But they're everywhere, obviously. We call these heptadic. That's a fancy word for sevenfold. Underlying heptadic structures, I'm going to suggest to you, is a signature of the author. You know how authors, sometimes artists, will hide their signature on some little defect in the painting? We go on and on, examples of authors that will put... Alfred Hitchcock would always appear as an extra in one of his movies. It's fun. And once you know that, it's fun to watch for that. They're little thing. Well, there's a fingerprint of the author here we're going to discover. And there's an automatic security monitor watching over every single letter of the text that doesn't rust or wear out, and it's running continually, has been for several thousand years. Did you know that? I suggest it's the fingerprint of the author. It's a non-compromisable design. What on earth are we dealing with here? I'm going to share with you, if you haven't discovered him before, the discoveries of a guy by the name of Ivan Panin. He was born in Russia on December 12th of 1855. He got caught in a plot against the Tsar, so he was exiled at an early age. He emigrated to Germany and ultimately to the U.S. He graduated from Harvard in 1882 with a PhD in mathematics. He discovered Christ. Now, every one of us that discovered Christ are the recipient of a miracle. But if you're a PhD in mathematics from Harvard, that's a big miracle. Okay? But he also, after discovering Christ, he discovered what is now called the heptadic structures that underlie the biblical text. He discovered that in 1890. Apparently, 8 years after his graduation. He committed the rest of his 50 years of his life, generating 43,000 pages, tightly small handwriting, didn't have a computer, did this all manually. And I'll show you some of the things he discovered. He went to the Lord in 1942. If we take the verses 9 through 20, there's several ways to parse them. One way is to take the first 3 verses that deal with the appearance to Mary, and then to take the next few verses that are really the subsequent appearances to others. And then we have the last 2 verses, which are the conclusion of the chapter. That's one way to parse the thing. There's another way we could do it. We could take the first 5 verses that are, or excuse me, 6 verses. That's a simple narrative. Then the next group of verses, are Christ's discourse. That'd be a natural way to parse this if we were to do it. And then, of course, the last 2 are the conclusion. I want you to remember that, just to get this clear. There's the appearance to Mary, subsequent appearances, and then conclusion. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at, parse it, if you will, simple narrative, Christ's discourse, conclusion. Either way, you can justify. Just remember those breakpoints, 9 to 11 or 9 to 14, 11 to 18 or 15 to 18, and then the 1920 is common. Okay. In the last 12 verses of Mark, Panin noticed a few things. In the number of words, if you add it up in the Greek, it turns out there's 175 words. That happens to be 7 times 25. Okay, big deal. The vocabulary, the different words, it turns out of the 175 words, there are 98 different words. That also happens to be a multiple of 7 exactly. Well, that's kind of interesting. Trying to do that deliberately is a real chore, by the way, to make those both come out that way. The number of letters in the Greek are 553. That turns out to be a multiple of 7 precisely. With no, when I say a multiple, there's no left over. You follow me? The vowels are a multiple of 7 exactly, and so are the consonants. Well, they would be, because they would be dependent on one another. The total vocabulary I said was 98. Okay. The vocabulary that's found before this chapter in Mark are 84 different words. Of the 98, 84 were used before, but those are all multiples of 7 exactly. You get a little creepy feeling by now? Could that have happened by just random statistics? I don't think so. The vocabulary that you find only in this chapter are 14, obviously, that would derive from that. The ones that are used in the Lord's Address, there's 42, that's again a multiple of 7 exactly. The words that were not part of his vocabulary are 56. Now, if every time I create a multiple of 7, if I have a multiple of 7, your chance of getting one of them right is 1 chance in 7. You've got 6 chances of losing, 1 of winning, right? If I give you 2 constraints that both have to be met, that's 7 squared. You got 1 chance in 49 of winning. Follow me? You need to be with me now. Okay. So if I have 3 constraints, it's 7 times 7 times 7. I got 1 chance in 343 of getting it right by accident. Okay? If I have 4 of these, it's 7 times 7 times 7, or 1 chance in 2,401. Do you see how that escalates very quickly? Because you've got only 1 chance of each 7 of winning, and if you've got 2 7s that both have to agree, you see. Okay, so if we just keep going like this, if I just took 9 of these things, I got 1 chance in 40 million. 1 chance in 40 million of it happening statistically by accident. Well, suppose I gave you a piece of paper and asked you to draft. Make up your own fictional last 12 verses of Mark. What are your chances of meeting 7 to the 9th constraints? 1 chance in 40 million. Okay? Okay, so would you like to try this? 7 to the 9th chances add up to over 40 million attempts that you're going to have to try if it's random. If you worked 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, there are 2,000 hours per year, or you have 120,000 minutes per year to apply to this. Now, if you can do a draft in 10 minutes, you've got 10 minutes each time you try, it'll take you 403 million minutes, or 3,362 years, if you're doing it by hand. Anyone want to try? I'm not true. It gets worse. I only gave you 9 constraints. Okay? Words. Total words, I told you, were 175. In the address of our Lord, there were 56. In the rest of the passage, there was 119. Each one of these are multiples of 7. Verses 9 to 11, that's one way to parse this, is a multiple of 7 exactly. 12 to 18, multiple of 7 exactly. Verse 12, multiple of 7 exactly. 13 to 15, multiple of 7 exactly. 16 to 18, multiple of 7 exactly. The conclusion, the last two verses, multiple of 7 exactly. Anybody want to speculate that this was just a statistical accident? I don't think so. It gets worse yet. In the Greek, Greek and Hebrew have the distinctive that every letter has a numerical value. So if that's true, and it is, then every word in the Greek has a numerical value. They call the study of that gematria. Okay? Now the numerical values, the total numerical values in the last 12 verses of Mark add up to 106,663. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. You got to be kidding. The verses 9 to 11, the geometrical value is a multiple of 7 exactly. Verse 9, multiple of 7 exactly. Verse 10, the first word, multiple of 7 exactly. The middle word, we're talking about verse 10 here. And then the last word. The first, the middle, and the last word, all are multiples of 7 exactly in terms of their numerical value. Verse 11, multiple of 7 exactly. And then from 12 to the end, the geometrical value is a multiple of 7 exactly. Can you imagine Panin, when he's discovering this, he must have had chills down his back, because this is just too impossible to have happened by accident. Let's go further. The vocabulary, I said, was 98 words. The ones, 14 not used before in Mark, 7 that you found later in the New Testament. There are 35 occurrences of these things. The numerical value is also, all these are multiples of 7 exactly. The vocabulary in verse 20 is a multiple of 7 exactly. The words found, the vocabulary found previously is a multiple of 7 exactly. Found only here, multiple of 7. Word forms. Total forms, 133. The value of the total of those are a multiple of 7 exactly. Those that occur once is a multiple of 7 exactly. Those that occur more than once is a multiple of 7 exactly. Occurring 63 times is again a multiple of 7 times, and on it goes. Total occurrences is a multiple of 7 exactly. The total value of the letters is a multiple of 7 exactly. I'll take one of these. One of these words is the word deadly. It's not found anywhere else in the New Testament. It has a numerical value of 581, which turns out to be a multiple of 7 exactly. It's preceded in the vocabulary by 42, or multiple of 7 exactly, in the passage itself by a multiple of 7 exactly. And so I gave you 9 before. I've just added a few more. In fact, I didn't stop at 17. I stopped at 35. So if we go down here, it turns out to have that happen accidentally is an awfully big number. Awfully big number. And you say I'm exaggerating. Panin didn't discover 34. He discovered 75. I stopped here because you'll see it gets ridiculous as far as we did. You want to try this now? You want to try doing this synthetically? You've got 7 to the 34th power to deal with. That's 5 times 10 to the 28 tries that you're going to have to be able to, you're going to have to try 5 times 10 with 28 zeros after it. Okay. Well, in this case, and by the way, there are about 3 times 10 to the 7th seconds per year. Okay. Let's assume I give you a computer that operates 400 million tries per second. Now, it will draft a candidate group of 12 verses by some statistical design. You can try 400 million of those per second, okay? If you can try 4 times 10 to the 8th tries per second, that means it's going to take you about 4.3 times 10 to the 12th computer years. In other words, if I gave you 1,000,000 supercomputers and gave you 4.3 million years to do it, you might have a chance of having this happen by accident. And that's with only 34 distinctive features of 7s. Panin has identified 75 of them. Anybody speculate that some scribe in a monastery added these 12 verses out of his imagination? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think we could do it with a computer. Comprehensive design of the whole Bible. Did you know the New Testament consists of 27 books? Most of you knew that. Terminations. That means each book begins and ends with a word. If there's 27 books times 2, that must be 54 words that terminate the different books of the Bible, of the New Testament. The total vocabulary of the is 28 multiple of 7 exact. Total vocabulary of the terminal book, the first and last words of each book. Total vocabulary is 28 different words. That's a multiple of 7. In the Gospels alone, it's 7. The total geometrical value of those 54 words are a multiple of 7 exactly. The value of the shortest word, which is one letter, is 70, which is 7 times 10. The value of the longest word is 1512, and that word is apocalypsis, and that's 7 times 6 times 6 times 6. I thought that's kind of interesting. Now, what about the unique vocabularies? Here's the one that gets to me. The vocabulary that's unique to Matthew is a vocabulary of words that occur 42 times, 7 times 6. It has 126 letters, multiple of 7 exactly. Now, let's assume that Matthew did that on purpose. Matthew wanted to contrive to have this particular property, okay? How would he have organized this? The only thing that these words have in common is that nobody else uses them, right? These are unique to Matthew. So how does he organize? Well, first of all, you get the other guys to agree not to use this list of words. How many think that happened? Okay, probably not. Well, you could use the argument then that if Matthew did this deliberately, he would have had to write his gospel last. So he could lay out all the other gospels there and see to it that he's got words that are multiple of 7 exactly that begin and end his gospel. Are you with me? Well, so I can, these words are unique to Matthew. So I can use this argument to prove that Matthew wrote his gospel last. But I got a problem with that hypothesis because the same thing's true of the Gospel of Mark, which means it was written last. But I'm still not through with my problems because Luke was also written last. Each one of these have words that are unique to them that begin and end the gospel that are distinctive to themselves. And the gospel, each one of these had to be written last. But by the way, so did James, Peter, Jude, and Paul. All 8 of them. Each must have written last because they each have that peculiar statistical characteristic. No, the Bible is absolutely breathtaking. The more we study it, the more we discover there's design, not only in the content, but in the very structure, a design that you can't replicate even with the power of computers. So this ends our review of the Gospel